Manyika is the president of Build Zimbabwe Alliance and a former presidential candidate. On this episode of The Hub, we sat down with Dr. Manyika and spoke on leadership, his rags to riches story, and the dirty game of politics.
Well, I think the assumption in your question is that there was something wrong with our environment. Well, maybe from the perspective of colonialism, yeah, there was something wrong with that environment. But we were blessed to have the parents that we had. We had very high expectations of us and didn't allow us to give ourselves any excuse not to succeed. And we are really eternally grateful for that generation. So I think I'm a product of the high expectations of the generation of our fathers. And it's interesting because when we were growing up, even in the rural areas, because my father was a teacher for many years before he became a diplomat afterwards. And he taught in rural schools. And we grew up without running water, without electricity, studying by candlelight. But we were expected to perform well. There's something about expectation, the right expectations, that just inspires you to do the right thing. So yeah, I am grateful for those expectations and that generation holding us accountable in spite of what was going on around us. When you say, how did you get into it, I think there is always this assumption a lot of times that you kind of join politics, and I don't subscribe to that. It's really where life brought me as somebody who saw the promise of this country and saw what could have been, and all of a sudden things have gone so wrong. And you have opportunities to live overseas and to see other countries working, other citizens participating in the political process without being denied the right to exercise their constitutional rights and so on. And then you see those outcomes. You see businesses being built, you see schools that work, you see hospitals that work, and then you start thinking, well, why is this not happening in our own country? So I came to that point where I said, well, you know what, we've got to do something. Initially, I was overseas for a number of years, and I would bring missions groups and would go into some of these challenged communities and would try to help. And then you realize that there is an environment that inhibits success, and it's a political environment. So unless you actually target the things that are going to change that environment, whatever you try to do in that context doesn't work. So I got to this point where I ended up in politics, as it were, but it's really where the journey of my life has taken me. In fact, this is connected to the last question that you just asked. If we don't change the political environment and, in fact, restore what I said earlier on, we had a generation that wanted its children to do better than them. In fact, we would get beaten, if we didn't succeed. And, your parents didn't have to be educated to have that high expectation of you. Something has happened, and it is a very sad situation in Zimbabwe that expectation is not there now in the post-colony. And that is something that is very, very sad. Even though we have people who spend a lot of money on their children to go to school and so on, we have this political class that really doesn't want the next generation to achieve more than they did. And that's a very, very selfish thing. So I think this is one of the reasons why I say the young generation needs to participate in politics and make sure that they put the right leadership in place, because that leadership is going to create the enabling environment for these young people to then play their part in this country and to benefit from it. So, we need, above all things, political change in this country to create that enabling environment for young people. Yeah, so I think a lot of times in Africa, and I see this even on social media, and sometimes I get surprised because this even comes from some young people who think that when you hold elders accountable, you are kind of violating some cultural norm that you shouldn't. You are committing the unpardonable sin when you do that. You know, in other cultures, young people, old people, middle-aged people, the transitional generation, which is what I call ourselves, everybody plays their part, in determining the future of their nations. And sometimes also when we say it that way, it seems like, people are being driven by some of these higher ideals that are not achievable. But, it's through allowing them to establish their businesses, to live their dreams, that economies and vibrant economies are actually created. So it's an unfortunate thing that at this point in our country, we don't have that, but we must fight for it. We must fight to make sure we create that environment where somebody who is gifted can thrive in their gifting. The interesting thing is that if governments looked at that the way they should, they would understand that they could actually sustain themselves, because it's your gifting as a musician, it's your gifting as whatever you are gifted to do that creates the kind of value that governments can tax. So and then those governments can provide the services that people need, and guess what? The electorate is going to be happy and they will re-elect you. So understanding that connection between allowing people to be who they are and to thrive in their giftings and sustaining yourself politically is something that is critically missing in this country, but you see it in many other countries. What alternative path? So anyway, let me give you a bit of background about me. So soon after high school, I was trained as a broadcaster. I was one of the first students. I think I was with the second group actually at the Zimbabwe Institute of Mass Communication, which is now at the Polytechnic. And so I could have been a broadcaster. I could be sitting in that chair actually interviewing you. That was a passion of mine. I loved law as well. And then later on in life, I actually went for training as a diplomat. So I went to a school called the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Washington, D.C. And Madeleine Albright, who became the Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, was actually one of my teachers. So I've always had this passion for ideas, communicating those ideas, understanding how people live and so on. So, I could have been a diplomat, but here I am. But perhaps the other interesting thing is that I could have been a musician for all my life. I actually do have, don't tell anybody, don't put this in this interview, that I do actually have a couple of albums that I've done, which are gospel albums, and I love music, I love writing and things like that, so yeah. I didn't realize you knew about that. So, well, actually, if we prevail in the war on poverty, we will have really stomped the devil. Because if you think about it, that is really the thing in our country that is a problem. That people live in such abject poverty, and there's so many pathologies, it's some really terrible things that come out of that. So as far as I'm concerned, the thing that we have to do in this country is to win the war on poverty, and in my view, that is really stomping on the devil. So I think a lot of times people mistake the need for strong leadership with the need to be dictatorial. I think leaders have to know what they are doing. They have to challenge people to respond to higher ideals. All of that is important. But they must never lose sight of the fact that they are not more important than the citizens that they lead, that the kind of leadership they are providing is for the benefit of the citizens. The moment you lose that, then you are just a leader for the sake of being a leader and for self-aggrandizement. In our country, we have a serious problem of leaders who make themselves more important than the people that they lead, and who have absolutely no empathy for the problems that people are going through. And the moment that you are trying to make them aware of what you're going through, they react with violence and repression and things like that. That's not leadership. That's something else. And also what you see in our country is people think that you have to be a leader in order for you to live well as a leader, above everybody else. But I think that is a very dangerous thing. You must live well because you've started a business and it's a legitimate business and you're producing legitimate value and you're being rewarded for that. You go into leadership to serve. And for me, that's absolutely critical. You have to serve the people that you lead, and if that's not important for you, there's a problem. So the motivation for the War on Poverty Trust, and even when we started, some of you might be aware of this, that when I ran for the presidency, we had a manifesto which was in two parts. So part one of the manifesto talked about some other things. It had a 10-point plan about things that we believed in and so on. Then part two was the War on Poverty Manifesto, because I believe that anyone participating in politics in a country such as ours must really focus on the fact that over 70% of our people live in abject poverty. That's a serious crisis. If 70% of the people in this country live in abject poverty, think of the condition of lives of their children, of the next generation as a result. So we have got to win the war on poverty in order to change the destiny of this country. And as far as I'm concerned, that should be the preoccupation of every single leader in this country. How do we win the war on poverty? How do we make sure that the communities are really productive and they're performing at a very high level, so that they can be the surplus that is needed to meet the needs even of people without. So that was the motivation for the War on Poverty Trust. Let's focus, directly focus on how we can change the destiny of this country by winning the war on poverty. The other things that I have worked on, so the Light the Way project, by the way, is an initiative of the War on Poverty Trust. What we believe is that we have got to bring the gift of light to communities. If you change the way that people cook in the communities, the way that people fetch water and so on, you actually change the priorities that they have in terms of use of time. You change the pace of life in those communities. And so people can then now start investing in themselves, developing of a civic culture, the ideas that we need to implement in order to change our communities. They have time to do that. Right now, there are people who walk for 30 kilometers, women who walk for 30 kilometers to fetch firewood. And it's because we haven't really focused on the energy needs of rural communities. And I don't believe that we can win the war on poverty unless we change the energy poverty in these communities. So the Light the Way initiative is to address that. The Nexus Global Serve, in fact, was an organization that I started about 2 decades ago. And this was to link people who wanted to participate in solving some intractable problems in Africa. And these are Americans, British people from all over the world who would want to come here to help figure out how we can solve some of these problems. And so for over 2 decades, I've been bringing in groups, mission teams, and so on to do that. And Nexus Global Serve was created as a vehicle for it. I long to spend more time with the young people of Zimbabwe. I really do. I think that they can become our heroes if we take the time. So you see, what has happened in the past 40 years, which is tragic for our country, is that there are a lot of gaps which have been created, and these are knowledge gaps. So for instance, if I say to you, do you know anything about the Zimbabwe Conference on Reconstruction and Development, which happened in 1980? You are shaking your head. You don't know that at independence, there were donors who were brought into this country to fund things like the Manpower Development Survey, which looked at all the sectors in the country and said, we need this, we need doctors, we need engineers, we need this. So for the next 20 years, we are going to train young people to fill those, you don't know about that, But there was a priority at first to make sure that the next generation would really participate in the building of this country. And, I talk to a lot of young people, and sometimes young people also don't quite understand why some of us might be so exercised about what went wrong, and we need to fill those gaps. I believe that from now and for the rest of my life, as a member of the transitional generation, it would be worth my while to spend time with young people and fill those knowledge gaps. In the process, it's for a selfish reason, by the way, in the process I'll also be inspired by them. Why do I say that? So I'm not a digital native. I am a digital alien. You are digital natives. And we're living in a world which is very different from the world that I grew up in. And I need, even at this stage in my life, to know how to be a digital native, to manipulate things like you guys can. So for the benefit of my business, the trust that I lead, or the political initiatives that I lead. So I've met a lot of interesting people, but I would love to spend much, much more time with the next generation in this country. That's a trick question. Who was it? Are you sure you want me to answer these questions? So that's why you are very cruel. What was your question again?
Who do you think was a better leader, Nelson Mandela or Robert?
Look, I truly believe that we have had historic leaders on the African continent, okay? And at different stages in the life of the nation, they expressed themselves. And we owe a lot to those who fought and gave us our independence. That's something that every one of us we should acknowledge. But there's a lot that went wrong in Zimbabwe, a great deal that went wrong in Zimbabwe. When it comes to South Africa, there was a recognition by Nelson Mandela that he couldn't be the leader to bring the nation of South Africa where it needed to be in terms of economics and things like that. So, he stepped down from power, which is something that is really incredible. I do say that there might have been an opportunity lost there, because I don't think that anyone could have taken South Africa through the critical conversations that South Africa needs to have to transform the structure of the economy and things like that. I don't think anyone else could do that except Nelson Mandela. And that was not necessarily done. So, hey, he was a great example in the sense that he came out of prison. He was not bitter. He didn't hold on to power and things like that. But I do believe that there was a missed opportunity there. Bigger missed opportunities in Zimbabwe. Much, much bigger missed opportunities. We had a functioning economy. We had infrastructure that was working. We had so much promise. And in some ways, we still have the resources that could make us a great country. We're one of the highly educated countries on the continent. We have tremendous resources, but something went wrong, and it went very, very wrong. And you can't right now compare of the middle class in South Africa with us. There's a very big difference. But then when you go to South Africa, you must understand that there are people on the bottom rung of the social hierarchy that are really, really suffering as well. And that is the reason why you find, parties like EFF coming up and, some people even, gravitating towards them. Well, you know what? In some ways, and hear me right when I say this, because this may sound insensitive, but it's something that I truly believe in. This moment that we are in is a very important moment, and perhaps in some ways, the best thing that could happen to us right now. Because now we truly understand what bad leadership is and the danger of replacing bad leadership with their progeny. We understand that now, okay? I don't have to tell you guys, don't have to tell the next generation about the dangers of, replacing the previous leadership with people who were in the same government, So you understand it now. So maybe it will be less expensive to run for office now because I don't have to message that. I don't think I have to message that to anyone really, because you are living in the reality that the choices that people made electorally created. So I have hope that we have learned our lesson. I really do have hope that we have learned our lesson. It requires us to continue, though, to remind people, because sometimes we forget very easily, but I have hope that between now and 2023, we can really wake up and prepare to make the right electoral decisions when we get that opportunity. The other hope that I have is that Zimbabweans are really willing to engage, which is why we created the War on Poverty Trust. I truly believe that Zimbabweans are ready to bypass the political arguments and so on and go directly into their communities to serve people. I've met so many professionals, I've met doctors, I've been approached by doctors who have said to me, hey, listen, what can we do? Is there any way that we can get connected with resources outside so we can serve communities strategically? And that's an exciting thing. And we must continue in spite of what is going on. I was telling someone that, because someone said to me, well, okay, that sounds like you're going back now because you said, you've got to create the right environment in order for you to help. I don't think that, one thing excludes the other. We must create the environment whilst we're still working in these communities to make a difference. Because what gives us the relevance so that people can make the right choices when it comes to political leadership is what we're doing on the ground. So I have a lot of hope because I hear from Zimbabweans, what is it that we can do in the communities? Can we rebuild derelict schools? Can we provide resources for hospitals and things like that? And I think we should step that up, and there's an opportunity too.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Hub. To know more about our amazing guest, check out his social media handles in the description below. Until next time, this is The Hub.